Hi everybody. In today's Economics for International Students, we're going to look at a question from Micro. So this is the AP Micro FRQ number 3, free response question number 3 from 2012. It's an international trade question, and it's a pretty good summary of most of the key concepts on trade-related questions. You can see here that I've highlighted a number of the terms, the vocabulary in the question. I think these are the words that some students may or may not have trouble with, or at least may not yet be very familiar with. I've made a list down here, so why don't we first have a look at these terms and then we will tackle the question. We will try the question. So what do I have here? I've got price taker. Okay, you may remember from your classes, price taker means that the company, or in this case the country, is a small part of the market, either production or consumption. Therefore, it doesn't have an impact on the price. It can produce as much as it likes or as little, consume as much or as little. It will have no significant effect on the market price. In other words, there are many other producers and or consumers. That's a price taker. Domestic, you probably know this. This means within the country itself, so not international. We'll see how it's used in the question. Import means to bring into the country. Again, probably you are familiar with this. World price is the established price in the world market. If it is different from the domestic price, then the country will either import or export. We'll look at that in the question too. A pound here, this is an imperial measurement. It's about 454 grams. Impose means to put in place or to establish. For example, a tariff, which is the next word, a per unit tariff. A tariff is a tax on imports. So when we bring the sugar in this question into the country, the government will put a tax, an import tax called a tariff, on each unit, on each pound of sugar. Identify means to locate, find, or describe, depending on the question. Consumer surplus is the difference between willingness to pay and the price that consumers actually pay. So the difference between the demand curve and the price looking at the y-axis on the graph. Tariff revenue, well, we know that a tariff is a tax on imports, so revenue is the value of that tariff to the government. And we'll see where that is found on the graph in a minute. Given something, so this is used to start a question in which you have an assumption, something that is a hypothesis. So granted that, given that, x, comma, y. Okay, we'll see how it's used in the question. Maximize means to create the most possible, the largest quantity or amount of possible. The opposite of this, the antonym, would be minimize. And then finally, producer surplus, which is related to consumer surplus in the sense that they're both related to the price. Producer surplus is the difference between the costs of production and the price at which the product or service is sold. And again, you look at your y-axis and compare the supply curve to the price to determine it. I've included deadweight loss, which is sometimes written DWL, because it's relevant to the last question. I also put a business dictionary link here. It's just one that I found at random. There's lots of them. When you're studying economics or any social science, or indeed any subject, your textbook should have a glossary at the back, so you probably don't need this. But if you don't have a good glossary or even an index in your textbook, then make use of the websites that are on the web to find business and economics related meanings for your vocabulary, so that you're not using the general meanings from day-to-day English, because that could lead to some confusion. So now let's look at the question itself. We've got sugar is freely traded in the world market. Assume that the country, so given that the country, Loriland is the name, is a price taker in the world market for sugar. Okay, so it's a price taker. It has no impact on the world price, or very little. Some of the sugar consumed in Loriland is produced domestically while the rest is imported. So the question stem tells you this is an importing country. The rest of the question stem, and just looking at the graph though, will tell you that the world price is lower than the domestic price. So if they did not tell you this, you should be able to determine it. So it says world price of sugar is $2 per pound. The graph shows Loriland sugar and the world price is PW. Okay, so if you didn't have this information in the question stem, this is called the question stem here, the description, you could determine that Loriland, this imaginary country, is an importer because their domestic supply and domestic demand equilibrium price is $5 per pound, while you can see PW, world price down here, is $2. So world price is lower than domestic price, so the country will be importing some of its supply. So the first question here, it says, at the world price of $2 per pound, how much sugar is Loriland importing? Okay, so let's take a look at the graph. So you can see here that at $2 per pound, the world price, domestic suppliers will only supply 2 million pounds, while consumers, the quantity they will demand is 14. So the difference between the two gives us the amount that's imported. So 14 minus 2 is 12. You don't have to show your work. It doesn't ask you to show your work, but you could write 12 million pounds. So I'm just going to write 12. And that is your answer for A. Part B asks us about a per unit tariff that's put in place by Loriland, this country, on imports. So it's going to increase the price to $4. So let's see what that looks like. That takes us up to here. A tariff will increase the amount supplied, the quantity supplied by domestic producers. So you can see they're moving from 2 million to 6 million. The higher price, though, as we would expect, will reduce the quantity demanded. So we're going to move from 14 million pounds to 10 million. So the new level of domestic production is going to be 6 million pounds, right? So this is the amount they're now supplying to the market. We've still got imports, but it's a smaller amount. It's going to be 10 minus 6. So let's look at the next part. So now let's determine B2, which is calculate the domestic consumer surplus for Loriland, this imaginary country. Show your work. So you have to show the calculation. So first let's look at the graph and determine where it is. Okay, this is part of question B. So we know the tariff price is it's going to be $4. So it's going to be this triangle area here. I'm going to draw it in purple. So we need to calculate the area of this triangle to determine the new consumer surplus after the tariff has been added. Okay, so let's calculate that. I'll just type it out here so that it's a little easier to read. So the surplus calculation, we're going to look at the difference between $9 and $4. That's the vertical distance of the triangle, so that's $5. And we're selling 10 units, 10 million pounds. So we're going to multiply that, and then we're going to divide it by 2 because it's a triangle. That gives us a $25 surplus, consumer surplus here. So I've drawn it, I've written it out over here. The next one asks us to calculate the total tariff revenue collected by the government. Okay, again it says you must show your work, so we have to do another calculation here. So the tariff revenue is going to be the value of the tariff multiplied by the number of units that are imported. So let's just draw that on the graph first, and then we will see what the calculation looks like. So we know that the domestic producers are going to be supplying 6 million pounds with the total price of $4. The difference between the world price and the new price is $2. So it's going to be a vertical distance of $2 multiplied by the number that is imported. Okay, so the number imported, we've got 10 million pounds in total, of which 6 million are domestically produced, so the difference has to be 4. So 4 times 2 gives us 8. So $8 is the value of the tariff revenue, import tax, tariff revenue that is collected by the government. So I'll just draw that out very quickly here so you can see the calculation. So the calculation would look like this, and when it asks you to show your work or explain, you do need to write this out if it's on the AP exam. So 10 minus 6 is the quantity, $4 minus $2 is the price difference, that's the value of the tariff per unit, gives us an $8 tariff revenue for B3. Now for the last part of the question, C tells us that given the world price, so there's that word given, so granted or assume, you could say assume the world price is $2. So what per unit tariff maximizes, gives us the largest amount, maximizes the sum of Lauraland's domestic consumer surplus and producer surplus. So in other words, this question is asking us what per unit tariff will give us the largest total surplus, consumer plus producer surplus. Now this is a trick question that many students have trouble with. Anything that distorts the market, such as a tax, of which tariffs are an example, will lead to deadweight loss. Remember down here I mentioned this, deadweight loss. So deadweight loss means that some economic activity, some business transactions do not occur because of a market distortion. So if you just look at this graph, at which point do we maximize total surplus, which is your consumer surplus plus your producer surplus? And clearly it is no tariff. That's where we started at part A. Okay, so we would be consuming 14 million pounds, of which only 2 million pounds would be produced domestically. So you might say, well, the producer surplus is so small here, it is more than outweighed by the consumer surplus, okay, which we could easily calculate 9 minus 2 multiplied by 14 divided by 2. You can check that on your own if you wish to check it. So this is a little bit of a, I wouldn't say it's a trick question, but it's a question to test your knowledge of how market distortions affect total surplus. Okay, so that is a relatively short question. If you're doing this in the exam, you should be able to do this in about, I would say, 5 or 7 minutes, much faster than I've done here. And a lot of these concepts will carry over into other questions, so you'll be well equipped to answer questions about taxes, about consumer and producer surplus, and trade in general. Okay, deadweight loss, if you had a question about deadweight loss, you would be looking at the triangles adjacent. Adjacent means next to the tariff revenue rectangle here. And that is the inefficiency of production or foregone consumption. That would be the explanation of those deadweight loss triangles, although that's not part of the question, so you don't need to include that. All right. And as I mentioned, if you're having trouble with any of this vocabulary, there's plenty of good business sites and economics related sites that you can look at to check your vocabulary. So that's it. I hope this was useful in reviewing probably some vocabulary and having a look at how some of these concepts are applied to a relatively straightforward, fairly simple question. So thanks a lot for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and good luck on your exams or in your studies.